chief of police, who also happened to be the town's veterinarian. One evening, late at night, he was awoken by a woman's frantic phone call. She screamed from the phone, "Please come quick." The man asked, "Do you have need of the police or of the vet?" "Both," she answered. "We can't pry our dog's mouth open, and there's a burglar's leg in it." I can see that picture. I'm not sure why, but I can see that picture. 183rd lesson in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 20. And we continue tonight. Like I told you, this is kind of these verses are kind of a geographical journey. But as I've read them and studied them, I've been able to get a lot more out of it than just all the cities that are mentioned. And what we're doing is that we're looking at 6 things that are indicators of Paul's love for the church. 6 things that indicate Paul loves the church. And we began that process last week, and we looked at his affection. His love was seen in his affection. And let me begin tonight by saying that it's good to know, I think it's good to know that Paul was an affectionate man. He's not a plastic walking robot or something like that. You know, just push the button and the verse pops out. I'm glad he's not what do you call that thing, a thumb drive or something like that. I'm glad he's a living, breathing person that somebody could fall on and cry on and kiss, as it's explained in some of these verses. There's something that tells me that he really loved the people, and the people really loved him because of the way they interacted with each other. They knew he loved them, and he knew they loved him. So back and forth, it was reciprocated. And I think it speaks of his love. I don't want to belabor that point, but Acts 20 tells us that Paul loved the church because of his affection. A second thing that shows us that Paul loved the church, he loved the church because of his, in your outline the word is giving. Okay? Isn't that a great way to measure love? What did Paul say in 1 Corinthians? He speaks of love seeks not its what? Its own kind. He's speaking there that love is always willing to give. And if you look in chapter 20 and verses 1 and 2, it says, after the uproar, and what was the uproar? The riot in Ephesus. After the uproar had ceased, Paul called the disciples. He's still there in Ephesus, and this is the greeting of the Ephesus Christians. They embraced him, and he departed to go to Macedonia. And incidentally, he went by way of Troas, which was north. Paul was down in Ephesus, so he would have gone north up to Troas, and he had to go to Troas to get across to Philippi. Okay? So he went from Ephesus, which was in the south, up to Troas to cross over the sea there. And when he's going over to Macedonia, in verse 2 says, now when he had gone over that region, and we'll stop there. So he took a trip up north to Troas, and to get across over into Macedonia. That's where the churches of Philippi, Berea, Thessaloniki would have existed. And the thing that's important here, and you'll say, well, what does that might have to do with giving? Well, it has a lot to do with giving. And you might say, why? Well, why did Paul go? Why did Paul make this trip? And what was the reason for his trip? Do you remember? Paul wanted to go to Macedonia. Why? He wanted to collect money for who? For who? For the poor saints at the church in Jerusalem. Now back in chapter 19 and verse 21, when he was still in Ephesus, it says, he purposed in his spirit, that means that he made up his mind. When he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia was the province in which Corinth existed, which today we would call Greece. He was going to Macedonia and Achaia, and then he was going to go to Jerusalem, and then from Jerusalem he would go to Rome. So his plan was to go to Macedonia, and then the riot had come and everything was kind of closing up there, so it's about time for him to leave. And his purpose in leaving was to gather a collection. And let's just talk about that for a minute. If you look Corinthians 16. 1 Corinthians 16, before he left Ephesus, before Paul leaves the city of Ephesus, he writes the book of 1 Corinthians. All right? Give you a time reference. And in it he expresses something of the reason he's coming to Macedonia. Verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 16, he says, "Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so you must do also." Okay? So Paul is in Ephesus, and up here is Troas, and here's Galatia, okay? And then over here is Macedonia, north of Greece, what was once considered to be the area of Bulgaria. It's got a new name now. The Greeks and the Macedonians fought about the name for about 20 years, and I think Macedonia has a different name that reflects what they consider to be their Macedonian heritage. And then when you come down further into Greece, that's Acacia. Okay, so all of these locations have some meaning to you. So now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, so much you do also. So he's telling them, I've already talked to these other churches about taking up money for the saints in Jerusalem. And now he's writing to the church in Corinth, and he's saying it's time for you to take up your collection. And he writes ahead to them, and he says, I told the Galatians, it's kind of like get your offering together, and I'm reminding you now by writing to you. This is one of the items he writes about in the letters, to get your stuff ready. And he says, I'm going to come to you. All right, if you look in verse 5, same chapter, 16. When I passed through Macedonia, so in Ephesus he writes this letter saying, I'm going to go through Macedonia, and I'm going to come to you and collect this money. Corinth is further down in the peninsula of Greece, okay, down towards the bottom. And his purpose of going through Macedonia is to collect money. That was his desire. He wanted to gather this money because he was a giving man. And reasons behind his giving, okay, 2, maybe 3. For one reason, he was a man of integrity. In your outline, the word is integrity. And you remember, we studied in Galatians 2 that when Paul finally got to Jerusalem, after his apostleship had begun, he finally met with the Jerusalem leaders, and it says they approved of him, and they sent him out and said, you're a good man for the work, go do God's work, but we ask you to do one favor. You remember what the one favor was? Remember the poor of Jerusalem. And you want to know what? The church of Jerusalem was poor, dirt poor. They lived in the lowest of the slums. They were put upon by everybody. So that statement, Galatians 2, the very thing which I also was eager to do. Paul's a man of integrity. They asked him if he would remember the poor saints of the church in Jerusalem. He said he would. So one of the reasons he wants to collect this offering is to establish his integrity in their eyes. The integrity of his word. Your word is very important. Secondly, and then we're going to look at 3 things eventually, but I think secondly, and these 2 are probably a little bit more important than the first one, but the second thing, one of the more salient reasons for his thought process is that he recognizes that in Jerusalem, the words in your outline is, there is a real need. There's a real need in Jerusalem. These people are the poorest of the poor. In fact, in Acts 11, when the famine of Claudius has come along, these people would have died if it wasn't for a woman called Queen Helena. Queen Helena. And Queen Helena is a very, very interesting person if you ever get a chance to research her and read about her. But she imported dried figs and dried grapes and stuff and gave them out to the poor people so that they would have something to eat. If you were looking James 2:5, it indicates how poor these people in Jerusalem were. They lived like I said, in a slum. So there was a tremendous need, and here was an opportunity to express the fulfillment of Paul's love towards these people, and that's just one of his characteristics. He couldn't resist giving to people who had real needs. And here you see this example of it as well. So what Paul does is he begins wandering around the Eastern Mediterranean area, collecting money. And has Paul already been to all these places? Yes, he has. And why has Paul left most of these places? Because they've kicked him out. They've chased him out of town. And now what does he do? He goes back. And he goes from one hot spot to the next hot spot, knowing that everywhere he goes, everywhere he puts his foot, his life in essence is in danger. But he doesn't even think about that because he knows he's got an objective to care for somebody else. He's going to get done with it, even if it costs him his life. And you remember what happened to him all the time. He's taking this collection for Jerusalem. Throughout the whole trip, everybody's telling him, and they tell him, Paul, they're going to get you. People continually warn him. And remember what he said in the 20th chapter. We'll get to it in a few lessons. They keep warning him all along the way. And Paul, you're going to get in trouble. You're going to get it. You can't go through that area, that territory again. And he says, I didn't consider any of those things done, of those things bothered me at all. I was going to Jerusalem and went. See, that's the kind of the man Paul was. He knew there was a need, and he didn't care about the cost to himself. He just wanted to meet the need. And that's love, unqualified, meeting the needs of other people. And when you really love somebody, you're really willing to sacrifice yourself for their benefit. And I think there may have been another thing that may have been in his mind. He loved the church, not only in the sense of caring for the needs, but I think he loved the church in the sense of promoting the word in your outline is the word unity. And he saw this. He saw that the giving of all this money, which is coming from who? What type of people are in these churches that Paul has founded? These are Gentile churches. And all of these Gentiles are going to give to what kind of church in Jerusalem? A Jewish Christian church in Jerusalem. And Paul was always concerned about the unity of the body. There's always, in the early church, there's always a problem of Jew versus Gentile. And even when he wrote the book of Romans, he spoke about that same problem. So he had this in his mind all the time. And I think he's thinking, if I can take this offering to these Jerusalem Jews, and he's not going to take it alone, incidentally. He's going to bring Gentile couriers with him as representatives of the Gentiles' churches, and the Jews will see the love of the Gentiles for the Jerusalem church, and it will help tie everything together perfectly. Amen? And so Paul loved the church, and he loved it enough to meet the needs of the individuals, and he loved it enough to want to see the fulfillment of the prayer of Jesus Christ. Father, I pray that they may be, Jesus prayed, Father, I pray that they may be, in speaking of the church, Jesus said, Father, I pray that they may be one body. Amen. He didn't care what the cost was to himself. He didn't care. He wanders back and forth, collecting this money, gathering this stuff, and organizing the whole deal on behalf of the people in Jerusalem who are considerably far away. Beautiful expression of his love. So let's look at these first couple verses. I want you to first go to 1 Corinthians 16 again, significantly. Verse 16, 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. And he tells them, actually tells the church, again he's talking to the church in Corinth, he tells them how to gather the money. On the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. It's interesting that he says he doesn't want the offering taken when he's there. He's telling them this is something you should do ahead of time. You're giving, and it ought to be done in advance of when I arrive. Okay? So they've already planned it, they've already conducted it. And when I come, whomever you approve by your letters, I will send to bear your gift to Jerusalem. And In other words, whomever of your congregation you want to accompany me. That's how people went from place to place at that time in history. They went by the letter. That's how churches got the custom. When you wanted to move from one church to another church, even to this day, many churches require of you a letter. That's how that custom began, going from church to church. Paul always wrote letters for people to go from one church to another. So whoever of your congregation wants to accompany me, by approval I take. They're going to be going by letters of commendation. And he says, I like verse 4, but if it is fitting that I go also, they will go with me. And you know what that means? That's kind of what Paul is saying here. There's a loophole. If it's fitting that I go also. You know why he's saying that? Because he might not go. You know why? Because their offering may not be sufficient. He expected them to make a good offering towards the church in Jerusalem. And then he says, I'll pass through Macedonia and I'll stay with you for the winter. So he makes this little statement that you may send me on my journey. And what he's saying is that I have some flexibility here because I'm going to be back and forth. And if you don't make a good offering to begin with initially, then I can come get it later. And he says, for I do not wish to see you now on the way. In other words, I don't want to see you in passing. I really want to spend some time with you, but I'm going to stay in Ephesus right now. In verse 8, when does he say he's going to stay in Ephesus until? He's going to stay until Pentecost. Originally, he was going to stay in Ephesus until Passover. But then he changes his mind. And how many days is Pentecost from Passover? 50? 50 days. He stays 50 days extra. And so he was going to stay only until Passover. Now he changes his mind in Ephesus. He stays there 50 more days. Verse 9. Why do you do that? Well, he said, I'll tell you in verse 9. For a great and effectual door has been opened to me, and there are many adversaries. He's still fighting a spiritual battle in Ephesus, so he needs to continue on there for a while. So he stays. And he does get to Jerusalem by Pentecost. Originally wanted to be there by Passover. So when Paul then leaves Ephesus, having written this letter to the Corinthians, that's in your outline, the word Corinthians, and then instructs them about the offering, and he goes from there to collect the money. Now in verse 2 of Acts 20, going back to our source scripture, we pick up the story. Now when he had gone all over that region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece. So having having in his mind, he's decided what he's going to pursue. He implements his plan. He goes to Macedonia. And during these days when he leaves Ephesus, he of course goes up north to Troas again. He's going to go over to Macedonia on a boat. It's not a very long journey. And by the time he gets to Troas, over to Macedonia, what has he written then? He's written 2 Corinthians, okay? These books aren't written a long time apart. There's not a great amount of time in between the two letters. And in 2 Corinthians, he really unbears his heart. So I want to show you what he says when he writes back. Remember, what was the theme of 1 Corinthians? You're bad boys. 1 Corinthians is a letter of admonishment. You're bad people. You're not doing things the right way. So listen to 2 Corinthians 1:8. For we do not want to be ignorant, brethren, of your trouble. Some versions will use the word tribulation, which came to us in Asia. In other words, we've heard about you. Okay? The word has got back to me. And we were burdened beyond measure, he says. Very, very upset. Pushed to the extreme. And he says, above strength, so that we despaired even of life. Yes, we had the sentence of death in ourselves. What he's saying is that there was no human resource to prevent his death. So what he has to do is he has to trust that they're going to do what's right. And then he said that we should not trust in ourselves, but who? But in God, who raises the dead. Some versions will say, who phrase resurrection power. What Paul is saying is, we believe in what we're doing so vehemently that even if we die, we're going to trust in the resurrection power of God, and He'll bring us back to life to finish what we're going to do. Is that what you would say, Michael? Yes, okay. So he really believed this whole thing that he's trying to do with this offering, this whole big picture, Paul believed in such an extreme, to such an extreme, that he thought if he died in the process, God would bring him back to life to finish what he had to finish. So he states, if I were to die, God will raise me, so I get this offering there. And do you think he was committed? Or do you think he was tired? Yeah, he was tired. Do you think he got discouraged? Yeah, he got discouraged. But he was totally committed with his entire being to get this thing done, so he really pushes ahead. He had this desire, okay? But life is tough sometimes. So in 2 Corinthians 2, it speaks a little bit more of his anxiety. 2 Corinthians 2, verse 12. Furthermore, when I came to Troas to teach Christ's gospel, so he's supposed to go to Troas and get on over into Macedonia, into that area, but he stops. I couldn't go anywhere without teaching. He says the door was opened to me by the Lord. He came there and the door opened from the Lord, and so he stayed and taught in Troas. But he says, I had no rest in my spirit. Have you ever been in a condition where you have no rest in your spirit? Spiritually? Huh? And why did he not have any rest in his spirit? He gets to Troas, and who's he looking for? He's looking for Titus. And where's Titus? Well, he's not where he's supposed to be, because Paul thinks he's supposed to be in Troas, and he's worried because Titus has been down in Corinth, and he's waiting for him to come back and give him a report about what's going on in Corinth. You see, the Corinthians had received the first letter, and Paul wanted to know how they had reacted to his first letter, because he had such a love for the church. He wanted to know whether they had cleaned up their messes. And he said, I got there and Titus wasn't there, and I couldn't handle it. I didn't have any rest in my spirit. So taking leave of them, I went from there to Macedonia. So he goes over to Macedonia, and he says, what happened when he got to Macedonia? Well, what happened? Well, he met Titus. And what did Titus tell him? Chapter 7, verse 5. This is good. He says, when we came to Macedonia, our bodies had no rest. He's still worried about what's going on. We were troubled on every side. Outside were conflicts. Inside were fears. Things were going on outside. Things were going on inside. The fear, the anxiety that came with the facts of the Corinthian problems. In verse 6, nevertheless, God, who comforts the downcast, comforted us by the coming of Titus. Titus showed up. And of course, Paul directly attributed that to God, and that gave him reassurance. And Titus came with the news about the Corinthians that he wanted to know. What does it say in verse 7? Not only by his coming, but also by the consolation in which he was comforted in you when he told us of your earnest desire. Very strong word. Earnest desire, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even more. And you know what they did? They got Paul's first letter, and they believed, and you know what that caused them to do? The word in your outline is that they repented, or the word might be repent. I forgot how I worded it. So they got straightened out. You think that made Paul happy? Listen, that's what Paul lived for. And I love this phrase here. For even I made you sorry with my letter. I do not regret, though I did regret it. Do you know what he's saying? He's saying, I wrote you a really hard letter, and I'm not sorry I wrote it, but I'm sorry I wrote it. You know, sometimes you have to tell people things you really don't want to tell people. But sometimes you just got to tell them. You feel bad about telling them, but you got to tell them, so you tell them. And then hopefully everything works out for the glory of saying I perceive that my letter might have made you sorry, if you will. They have been a little harsh, though only for a while, and now I rejoice that you were made sorry, but not that your sorrow led to your repentance, for you were made sorry in a godly manner. Godly manner. When you get sorry, you get sorry in a godly manner. Really good words there. Okay? So in 2 Corinthians, which was written in Macedonia, if you will, the regions of north of Greece, he reminds them again after this that he's thrilled. He says about the offering, chapter 8, verse 1, he reminds them again to give towards the poor saints of Jerusalem. He goes through that, chapter 8, chapter 9. Here's the Apostle Paul, weary, tired, anxious over the spiritual life of his churches, pursued by his enemies, his life threatened, recognizing at any time that he could die. He has no physical power to restrain people if they come against him. Paul's not a big guy. He has a very small party with him. He has totally cast his welfare upon the power of the Lord, and yet he never asked for anything for himself. All he wants to do is get this offering together and give it to the needy saints of the church in Jerusalem. That's a giving man. That's the measure of the love of the man. See, we forget about the reverence with which we oftentimes forget about the reverence with which we should approach our God. And we oftentimes forget that Christ died for the church. We treat it as if it's a social club, as if it's a meeting place. It's the house of God. Boy, oh boy. The church for Paul was never a means for his own promotion. The church to him was just simply a place to love the beloved of Christ, whom he loved and whom he spent his entire life upon. And let me give you I'll give you a third point here in closing. I've got plenty of time. I may not have any when I get done, but I have plenty of time now. Just a few minutes. Third thing in Act 20. Third thing that tells you that Paul loved the church. He loved the church so much. He loved the church in his teaching. The word in your outline is his teaching. His affection, his giving, and in his teaching. Verse 2, that when he had gone over that region and encouraged them with many words, he came to Greece, or Acacia, I might say. Okay? Went down to Corinth. But I want you to see one little thing. He gave them or encouraged them with many words, and that's important. It becomes even more pointedly interesting in the next passage, which I'll continue to talk about in a couple weeks. When he preaches, remember Paul preaches an all-night sermon? And what happens? Yeah, guy falls asleep. Remember that? Let that be a warning to you. Guy falls asleep, and what happens? He dies. Yeah. What's his name? Eutychus? Don't fall asleep in church. All right? Stand warm. Well, I ain't waking you up. I don't have that. So nevertheless, the Apostle Paul has spent his time giving of exhortation. He's got a lot going on. His teaching. He's got a lot going on. He knows he's in the last leg. Paul, I think, during this process has made a realization. Paul knows he's never going to be back in this area again. He knows his time here has expired. That if he comes back again, they're going to kill him. And so he knows he's not going to come back. In your outline, the word is return. I sense that from reading this over and over, and he didn't come back. So it's almost like a farewell tour, if you will, a goodbye. And he knows the churches are established. He knows the churches have elders who can now teach, and he knows that the gospel has a foothold in this portion of the world. He knows he's not going to be back because of all the pressures, but he also knows in his mind that he has to go to Rome and And he wants to get all the way to Spain, although he'll never get there. And you know, there's a time when he could have felt sorry for himself. With all the pressures, he could go on vacation. He could go on vacation. I know I often want to go on vacation. But instead of that, he spends himself continually exhorting the people with his words. And that's the idea of teaching much. Paul was an interactive teacher. We see when he goes into the synagogue, he teaches lessons, and the people ask him questions, and the wording in the Greek is that they have a dialogue with each other. Much speaking, much teaching, much exhorting, much writing, as you've seen. Okay? We've seen in just this short time frame, he's written these two books to the church in Corinth. Okay? So this trip then to the church of Jerusalem kind of takes on the character of a farewell. And yet, even with that knowledge, he still is teaching. And just to pull that whole little thought together, that's a mark of a man that loves the church. He spends himself on teaching the church. Paul lived for this reason, and he lived for this reason only. In your outline, the word is to perfect every man. Paul says apostles and prophets and evangelists and teaching pastors are given to the church to do what? Perfect the saints. That's what he lived for. To him, that's what the church was. You know, it's a sad thing. You see so many churches today and so many men in ministries, and for them the church is a means to a successful career. Or the church may be a vehicle for their own ego. You know, everybody that teaches and preaches fights pride. You know, you stand before people and you try to speak for God, you have to fight with pride. But you know something, unless a man of God teaches out of love for the Lord Jesus Christ and out of love for the church, all of his efforts are ego-centered. When I prepare my lessons every week, I ask God over and over again to help me love the church more and more, to love his people more, to spend more of myself helping to perfect the saints. And that's all really I want to do. Now, as I've studied through this passage on Paul, I was convicted in my own life with a lack of my love sometimes for God's people. I want to love God's people more. And so many times, you know, I prepare lessons and I'm thinking about how I'm going to teach it and what I'm going to say and how I'm going to be witty and cool. And I say in my own mind, oh, but they're just going to love this and they're going to think I did a really good job on this. And then I have to smack myself upside the head and say, you know what? That's not a godly thought. It's kind of one of those deals, get behind me, Satan. You know? And then I can focus back on the fact that the only reason that I stand before you is not so that you can see what Steve Medeiros knows, but so that you can know what God wants you to know. And in knowing that, you can be fulfilled in all the perfect knowledge of his will. Amen? Amen. God gives us a love for the church. And you know, it's amazing to me how some people take the church or leave the church. You know people like that. They can come to church 1 week and they'll be gone 4 weeks. Or they might come 2 weeks and they'll be gone 2 months. And yet they comport themselves as if they're Christians. Where is the love for their church? Do I think church attendance equates to love for the church? You better know it. You better know it. How you spend your time is an indicator of what you love. Am I right?
Yeah.
Now there's a lot of circumstances around that. There's illness, there's things like that. But if you can be in the church, you should be in the church. So they come in, you know, people come in, they come out. You know, if God continues to give me teachings to teach, I intend, I had some great retirement plans. I am 65. I have started to collect my Social. Well, I can't collect it till next year. Nikki's collecting hers now. But I've been planning my retirement. I'm a planner. I like to plan. But as long as God gives me something to teach, I intend to teach until I die. And as I said, I thought about retirement. And as I've thought more and more about retirement, it's become more and more remote to me as I become older. I don't necessarily feel very good all the time, but how can you stop teaching if you love the church? How can you stop teaching the church? And that was what did the Apostle Paul do until his life ended? He taught the church. And how did his life end? Chopped off his head. And he never stopped teaching. And I know, I don't know what your spiritual gifts are. Wasn't that a great song that Don sang this morning?
Yes.
Amen.
Really.
And I've been talking to Don, and I've developed quite a relationship with him, and I've been encouraging him to sing. Because God has given him such a great, immense talent. And since he started singing, just in the past few weeks, I've seen him start to blossom because he's doing what the Lord has given him to do.
Amen.
So you ought to love the church, and you ought to use your gifts, your spiritual gifts, and your spiritual talents, and your plain old talents, whatever your talents might be. Maybe your talents working with kids, maybe your talents singing, maybe your talents helping in the office. Whatever your talents are, you should do something to help. Jesus bought the church at the price of his own life and the price of his own precious blood. I consider the church to be a treasure of Jesus, and it's committed to our care, all the saints that belong to this church. And we're to minister to each other in the way that is glorifying to Christ. Do you love the church? I just pray we'll not see the church as a means to our own gratification. I always pray that we will not see the church as an avenue for our entertainment, but to see the church as a ministry that we're to give ourselves to in total love for the sacrifice, to give our lives to give all that we have to. So Paul loved the church, and he gave them much teaching, and he never stopped, and he never rested. He taught and taught and taught. And by the time he gets to Troas, you can read his words are almost weary in the way that they're written. And we'll look at that some more next time. He's at the end of his rope, but you know what he does? He stops in Troas and he teaches. And how long does he teach? He teaches all night long. He's tired, he's upset, he's suffering from great anxiety, and he teaches all night long. He was committed. He had something to do. He had a message to bring. And you know what else he does in the same time frame? He writes another letter, a little letter to the church in Rome. This guy is remarkable, how much energy he has. So, well, I would tell you what Paul tells us. Don't give up. Never give up. All the things Paul did, and he never got weary. Well, I imagine he got worried, but he never gave up. And I believe that's a measure of our love for Christ. It's a measure of our love for Christ's people. For a pastor, the measure of his love for his people is how much he desires to help them become spiritually mature. You know, what do you want of your children? What I always wanted of Tiffany, I always wanted her to be everything she could be in the Lord. I'm pretty happy about it. Still got room to work, but that's what we want for people we love, don't we?
Amen.
We want everything that they can do. We We want them to succeed as greatly as they can succeed. And for us, that means to be drawn closer to the Lord. If I love you today, I want you to be all that you can be in Jesus Christ. I want you to be everything you could be spiritually. And you should want that too. And if you're having trouble with that, it's because you're having trouble loving Jesus today. You hear me? Because if you really love Jesus with all your heart, you're going to love his church, and you're going to love his saints. And you won't have an angry word for anyone, and anyone you have anger with, you will go to and make restitution to them in love. Amen? Finish. I'm done. Questions or comments, anyone?
How old was Paul at that time?
I don't know. Paul didn't, he didn't live a long life. He was kind of worn out pretty quick. I don't know. How old do you think he was, Michael?
He died between 62 and 65, it said. He was born in 04. So making around 58, 59 by the time he died. That's what they said.
Not bad for that time in history. A full life, But
Well, how long did it take him to become a Pharisee?
yeah, he was in training from. I'm not sure. Do you, Linda? Do you know how long Pharisaic training would have been at that time?
No, that was
That would have been extensive training, though. Paul was a brilliant man.
And then he studied in Galileo
Yeah.
afterwards. So
Yeah. He went through his training, and then he went into like a doctorate, an extreme doctorate program, if you will. He knew everything that you could know about the Jewish law, the Jewish mindset, and still, and he loved his fellow people. The Word tells us that he loved them, but.
So he was a very mature, accomplished man before he met the Lord on the road to Damascus.
Yes, he was a very learned man.
well, that would be how come God had to knock him off the horse.
Yeah, he had pretty high self-esteem until he was not blind. That'll take away some of that self-esteem. Kind of like the sinner outside the temple. Kind of like me and you. All right? Anybody else? Let's join hands. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it when you